The blade dropped with terrifying precision. It severed not just the neck of a king, but the spine of a kingdom. January 30th, 1649, Charles I, sovereign by divine right, was beheaded before a silent, stunned crowd in Whitehall. His blood darkened the wooden scaffold, soaking into the boards as if history itself was trying to hold on to him. Somewhere in the crowd, hidden behind a cloak and trembling hands, stood his son, 18-year-old Charles II, watching the executioners lift his father's severed head for all to see. If you're watching this, and you believe history is just dusty books and names you forget after high school, you're wrong. This is power, betrayal, exile, revenge. This is not a lesson, this is a reckoning. Subscribe now because you haven't heard the half of it. Charles didn't cry, not then. He couldn't. Survival required silence. Within hours, royalists fled London. Charles, now a king without a throne, was hustled through back doors and onto shadowed roads. Scotland, France, the Low Countries. He wandered from court to court, labeled a pretender, watched by spies, weighed down by hunger and humiliation. The English Parliament had declared monarchy abolished. England was now a republic, led by Oliver Cromwell, a man who saw kings as tyrants and execution as justice. Charles was declared a traitor in absentia. Every day he stayed alive was a defiance of law. He learned quickly how to shake hands with liars, how to smile in defeat, how to eat while being watched. He traveled under false names, sometimes as a servant, sometimes disguised as a merchant's son. In one brutal winter, he slept in barns and under wagons, fevered and nearly delirious. In another, he hid inside an oak tree for an entire day, boots full of mud, while Cromwell's soldiers searched the forest below him. There were moments when hope came close. An uprising in Ireland, a whisper of rebellion in England. But every time he tried to reclaim the crown, he was beaten back. Most crushingly at the Battle of Worcester in 1651, when his army was scattered like dust and Charles barely escaped with his life. That night, as he lay in a hollow ditch, clothes soaked in blood and rain, he made a promise. If I live, I will return, and I will remember. Not just who killed his father, but every man who cheered. The roads of exile were long, and they carved lines into Charles's face far younger than time had a right to. He traveled under names that weren't his, sat at tables where the wine tasted of pity, and made promises he had no way of keeping. In France, he was a royal guest with no gold. In the Netherlands, a political inconvenience, and in Spain, merely tolerated as a relic of a broken line. Everywhere he went, he was reminded, a king in exile is no king at all. Still, he plotted, not with the fire of youth, but with the slow, tightening grip of a man who's lost everything and has nothing left but memory and resolve. In 1650, Scotland saw a chance. Their interests aligned, briefly. They offered him a crown, under strict conditions. He must reject Catholicism, submit to Presbyterian rule, and denounce his mother's faith. He agreed, not because he believed, but because survival bends men in ways they once swore impossible. In 1651, Charles led an army across England. It was bold, it was desperate, and it failed. At Worcester, the Royalists were shattered by Cromwell's forces. The field was soaked in blood and mud, the smell of iron and damp earth choking the air. Charles fought. He fought like someone with nothing left. But strategy and courage weren't enough. By nightfall, the king was a fugitive again, fleeing on horseback through fields of dead men who had once called him Majesty. What followed were 6 weeks of hiding that would etch themselves into legend. He slept in barns, attics, the floors of peasant homes. A Catholic priest once fed him by candlelight, warning him to stay silent even in his dreams. And then, the tree. Boscobel Oak. Charles climbed it barefoot, heart hammering, and stayed hidden in its branches for a full day while Cromwell's patrols scoured the woods. Below him, soldiers joked about catching that coward prince. Above, Charles clung to bark and shadow, rain dripping from his hair, teeth clenched. That day changed him. He no longer saw kingship as destiny. He saw it as war. When Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, England held its breath, not in mourning, but in uncertainty. The republic he'd built had been held together by his will alone, and with that will now rotting in a grave at Westminster, the power structure began to crack. Parliament squabbled, army leaders jostled, people whispered, and in the background of it all, Charles waited. He was in Bruges when the first letters came. Old allies writing cautiously, nobles testing the air. Merchants in London began to print coins with his face again, quietly, in basements. The winds were shifting, and Charles, older now, less idealistic, knew better than to rush. He waited until General George Monk, a name history doesn't remember enough, marched on London with the discipline of a soldier and the instincts of a politician. Monk didn't declare for the king. He just made it clear. England wanted peace, and peace now had a face. In May 1660, Charles returned, but not as the boy who had fled. He came as a man forged by loss, exile, and failure. He stepped ashore at Dover with a measured smile, kissed the earth, and said nothing of revenge. Yet, London erupted in celebration. Bells rang, wine flowed in rivers, and cheering crowds tore down the last symbols of the Commonwealth. Banners read, "Welcome home." But Charles didn't forget that many of those same voices had once cheered his father's death. He was polite, gracious, careful, but he remembered. He walked into Whitehall, past the very place where the scaffold had stood 11 years earlier, and paused. Just briefly. His advisors thought it was nostalgia. It wasn't. It was calculation. He had returned not just to rule, but to restore a broken crown by reminding the world why it should fear losing it again. Justice, Charles believed, did not require noise, only certainty. He began quietly. Names were compiled, not whispers of dissenters, not mere enemies, but those who had sat in judgment of his father. The regicides. 59 men had signed the death warrant of Charles I. Some were dead, some had fled, but many still walked freely, believing the past had been buried with Cromwell. They were wrong. In 1660, Parliament, eager to show loyalty, passed the Act of Indemnity and Oblivion. It pardoned most crimes committed during the civil wars, except one, the execution of the king. And so began the trials. Some begged for mercy. Others stood defiant. A few had grown old and frail, hoping time would protect them. It didn't. One by one they were brought to court, and the charges were read aloud, not of treason, but of regicide. Execution by hanging was standard, but for the most prominent among them, Charles made a personal addition to the sentence. Thomas Harrison was the first. A former general under Cromwell, he was dragged through the streets on a hurdle, hanged until nearly dead, then cut down. His abdomen sliced open, intestines pulled out, his body quartered. But the most brutal sentence was saved for a man named John Cook, the very prosecutor who had led the charge against Charles I. It was not enough for him to die. He was to be broken. In front of a crowd in Charing Cross, he was hanged, cut down alive, and then castrated. His testicles were held up to the crowd. The executioner shouted, "Behold the traitor's seed," before burning them on a brazier next to the scaffold. The crowd recoiled, then fell silent. Charles wasn't there. He didn't need to be. His message was already clear. This wasn't just punishment. This was memory turned into spectacle, a warning cast in blood and ash. And as London trembled, Charles sat in his chambers, sipping wine, listening to the bells ring once more. The cheers faded, as all cheers do. What remained was silence. Charles II sat on the throne, restored by law, crowned by ritual. But it was the blood that had spoken loudest. His court was lively, his mistresses famous, his wit sharp. London called him the Merry Monarch. But behind the laughter, the king had become a man others watched carefully, never quite sure when the smile might vanish. Justice, once served, leaves a residue. Some whispered that he had gone too far. Others said he hadn't gone far enough. But no one said it loudly. The executions, the public dismemberments, the castrations, they lingered in the minds of those who walked past Charing Cross or Whitehall. The air itself seemed to remember. Even Charles's own supporters learned to speak with caution. The Restoration had restored more than a monarchy. It had restored fear. Years passed, England stabilized, trade grew, science blossomed, and the plague came and went like a shadow. The Great Fire consumed half of London, but Charles rebuilt it. Not just the buildings, but the narrative. He was seen on the streets, helping organize the response. People cheered again, but with a new tone. Admiration wrapped in unease. He had become a king who saved his city and shattered his enemies. A ruler who could smile and still order your flesh burned from bone. Late at night, Charles often walked the halls of Whitehall alone. Once, a servant overheard him standing by a tall window, staring out over the Thames, whispering only, "They will not forget." I made certain. When he died in 1685, his body was buried with ceremony. But it was his reign that was remembered, with awe, with pride, with quiet dread. The Restoration was complete. The revenge, absolute, and somewhere in England, a weathered scaffold creaked softly in the wind.